Hello, everyone, and welcome again to another Teacher Joseph podcast. Well, today we're going to talk about Florence Nightingale, the 19th century nurse. A few of you have been asking me to talk a little bit more about history and the history of the UK. So I thought today we could focus on a woman who is very important in the history of the UK. Her name is Florence Nightingale, and she's incredibly iconic. She's a name which we all know. We all know basic information about her. She was a nurse in the 19th century, and she pioneered changes within the nursing industry, and she also made nursing more fashionable for women, because in the old days, nurses generally were from impoverished families and they were untrained. So Florence Nightingale changed all of that. 2020 was the 200th anniversary of Florence Nightingale's birth. As well as being a British icon, even when we mention her name, we still get this image of a woman walking in darkness, carrying a lamp, with some kind of intense gaze, hair pulled back, and of course wearing a cap. You know, nurses, they used to always wear a little hat on top of their head, and in Florence Nightingale's day, that little hat was like a veil. It was something which covered both sides of the head. And of course, we know why that was. That's because the nursing industry, or the nursing profession, was started by nuns. That's why we often refer to nurses as sisters. So if you're planning on calling a nurse something, if it's a woman, we would call her sister. So if I know the nurse's name is Nurse Scott, I would call her Sister Scott. That's a little bit outdated now because, of course, we have many male nurses, but I do still hear people calling nurses sister, but we don't call male nurses brother. We generally just don't call them anything. I've heard some nurses being called staff nurse. I don't know what that is, staff nurse. Or you could, of course, just refer to the nurse by her title, nurse. Thank you, nurse, in the same way as you would with a doctor. But sister seems to be still very common. Anyway, back to Florence Nightingale. Yeah, if you look online, you'll see a lot of artwork about this woman walking in darkness with a lamp, while there's men who are soldiers who quite clearly have been in a war. And that's because during our colonial days in the mid-19th century, she went to some different places in our colonies to treat the soldiers. I think the biggest one of those was Australia, where she brought great comfort to soldiers who had been wounded in the Crimean War. She has had many movies made about her. The British film star Anna Neagle was famous for portraying Florence Nightingale, and so was Jacqueline Smith. Now, I mentioned her last week because I follow her on Facebook. She was in Charlie's Angels. She's this kind of like really glamorous American woman. So she also played Florence Nightingale. There's been many stage plays in the theatre, radio plays as well. She's had many things named after her, such as an asteroid, a Dutch aeroplane, a US Navy ship. She's also featured on our stamps for sending letters, and also our money, our banknotes, featured Florence Nightingale up until 1994. So she basically came from a very well to do family. A well to do family means a well off family, a rich family. And of course, in the 19th century, that was quite a big thing. But her father believed that women had a right to be educated. Now, that was very unusual in those days for any class of person, but particularly among the middle class. So she was very lucky because it means that she was taught more things like mathematics than she would have been uh, if she, for example, was perhaps born into a family where they didn't care about education. Most women in those days were widows or unemployed servants who had to find a way to live. It seems not much has changed in different parts of the world. If you like Charles Dickens, he wrote a novel uh, which was called, I think, Martin Chuzzlewit, which was about a nurse, or at least a nurse was in it, called Sarah Gamp, and she's shown as being untrained and incompetent. And that's the way they were in those days. And Florence Nightingale once said, it seems very strange that when you put someone into a hospital, that they should get more sick instead of better. Yeah, again, some people would say not a lot has changed. So she had a lot of literary skill and personal philosophies given to her by her father. Um, and her father gave her an annual income of £500. So, of course, that helped her to survive quite well. Um, so she was involved in the Crimean War. And while she was making observations about soldiers and the conditions in which the hospitals were in, um, she began to notice how really bad the conditions were. Hospitals in those days really had huge failures and mismanagement. And not only in the hospitals, but the whole war seemed really strange and odd. And she began collecting evidence with an understanding that living conditions of soldiers and civilians were really crucial to health, and she campaigned for better sanitary conditions in hospitals and in working class homes, and that had a major impact on UK living. She also conducted research on the army in India, demonstrating bad drainage, contaminated water, overcrowding, and poor ventilation were causing high deaths. So she was definitely ahead of her time, wasn't she? And she was great with statistics. Yeah, I mean, by today's standards, it would have been seen very strange in those days, I suppose. She had her own types of pie charts before they were even invented. From the 1860s, trained nurses were introduced into workhouses so that sick people were no longer treated by other poor people. So all very good things that she did there. So that's probably why she's remembered as an icon. And she set up the nurses' training at St Thomas's Hospital, where the very first graduate nurses who were trained in healthcare could work in hospitals. Because before that, it was just poor people who went to the hospital to work. They didn't have any medical training. Very sad. International Nurses Day is on her birthday, which is on the 12th of May. So she lived in the 1800s. That's the 19th century. So she was born around 1800s, and she did all these wonderful things. I don't know exactly when she died, but I think it probably was between 1860 and 1900. I haven't checked, but a wonderful example of a woman with a vision. We don't get that very often. I was just saying to someone the other day that principled living seems to have disappeared. Principled living was something that the older generations had here. I know my parents and grandparents had it, and that means that you had one principle that you believed in, let's say Christianity or Islam, or the right for education in the case of Florence Nightingale, to be educated about health, or to live in better sanitary conditions. And every other part of your life was changed to suit that principle. So you had one main idea or belief that you had, and then everything else fitted around that to try to compensate for that kind of idea, you know? So, really, a wonderful way of living, whereas now people tend to just look at symptoms and effects. They don't tend to see what the principle is, even if there's a principle there. So, for example, if I feel that everyone's entitled to better English, that's something which I carry into my English classes. But you might not pick that up if you just see me teaching. You might think, oh, Teacher Joseph, he has a job. So a principle is something which is centered in your life, and then all other parts of your life are centered around that. So, for example, if you have a principle that you don't like gambling, then of course you don't gamble. You encourage other people not to gamble, and you don't marry a gambler. So things like this. But these days, people tend not to live like that. So Florence Nightingale clearly had a principle and a vision. So that's wonderful, isn't it? Well, that's it from me, and that's all about Florence Nightingale. So I hope you've enjoyed this, and let's talk again soon. Thank you, and goodbye.